31st installment of American Spirits. We are back once again with our esteemed new co host, Mr. George Bagby, here to discuss the funding of the new nation. Mr. Bagby, wherever did they get the money?
Indeed, it's quite a story. It's been so pleasant to retreat into the history of the early republic in these weird times that we're in. History certainly is a refuge for the mind in times when the news gets so confusing. I wanted to start out with a note. I I think I mentioned in the previous stream that Robert Morris went into debtor's prison, and I attributed it to the failure of the Continental Congress bonds, which he was managing at the time. It
Hmm.
seems he went into debtor's prison for another reason. It had to do with other speculations that he was involved in. He went over his head and things failed, and he went to debtor's prison. But it wasn't about the Continental Congress bonds. I wanted to correct myself on that.
Even our errata are compelling here on American Spirits.
I hope so.
And Charlie, welcome to you as well.
Yeah, thanks for handling the hosting duties for me today while I am not predisposed to do so, but I am here.
Neither rain nor snow nor hail will stop Charlie from. I can't come up with a rhyme.
No, considering what we're trying to rhyme with, we can't talk about it anyway. Um, but yeah, so I did a good amount of the reading you had sent over, Mr. Bagby. One of the books, actually, can you give us the title? It's one of your Tall Men books, is it not?
Well, it's in production right now. It's over 75% ready. I've got to order the cover, but I've already arranged for that. It's called Washington and His Colleagues, and it's one of the Chronicles of America series. And it is focused mostly on the Washington administration, the first presidential administration, and it also goes over into John Adams's administration, which is, I think, very interesting. I'm on a mission to read more about the Adamses. I find them very compelling figures, though controversial ones. I like them because they did not they weren't interested in flattering the populace. They were very opinionated, driven men, very well-informed statesmen, some of our very best and most creative,
No,
whatever else you
indeed.
can say about them.
In the
Um,
course of
but
these
they,
last 31 explorations of the history of the early American Republic, I have come to the conclusion, which surprised me, that John Adams was the single most consequential man in the American founding.
I really like John Adams, and I make no apologies for that. He was such an extraordinary figure, and he even made it into Russell Kirk's conservative reader,
Hmm.
which is a wonderful little book if you can get it. It's the Viking portable series. There are millions of these things around. You've got the portable Thoreau and the portable Twain and the portable Conrad and things like that. The Greek historian reader, and there's a portable conservative reader which has selections from Edmund Burke and also Alexander Hamilton and John Adams, among many others. But the excerpts
And
in there from
yet,
Adams.
in this
uh,
benighted age of popular culture, it is Abigail Adams who got a Broadway musical.
oh, well, that's Broadway for you. I, I'm not a fan of Broadway as such. With apologies to our friend Mr. D. Um, so I wanted to frame our conversation today. The Continental Congress was in such hopeless debt. The debt, I didn't look up the exact figure. It was in the hundreds of millions, which was just an insurmountable quantity back then, especially for an authority that had no taxing power.
And that was in the days when a dollar was an ounce of silver.
Indeed. We ought to calculate for that. I don't know what that would amount to now, but they did defraud their bondholders by devaluing it to tens of millions. So they just knocked a decimal point off of it, or something. They moved the decimal point on the total of the debt and devalued the entire debt. Now, when the Constitution is ratified by the states, the Constitution does contain a line honoring the debts of the former regime. But it was still an outstanding question in what way that would be honored. Maybe the new regime would also move the decimal point again or something. Really, nobody knew what the bonds were going to end up getting redeemed for. Oh, pardon me. I've got to rescue my cat.
Oh, no. We are great
Cat wanted to get out.
Feline rescue here on American Spirits.
He was wanting to sit in my lap, but cats get other ideas. So the Constitution has this clause about honoring the debts of the former regime, but no one knew how it was going to happen. So when Washington is inaugurated, financial stability is his number one priority, and a major mandate. This was something that gave much credibility to the Federalist scheme with the Philadelphia Constitution. It was going to be a solvent, fiscally responsible government, much unlike the previous government. In the last years of the Continental Congress, they had enough credibility with this scheme of the Federalists to organize a new constitution. They got an opportunity to refinance their debt with the Dutch Republic. So this was a consolidation kind of loan with the Dutch. And it rounded the interest into the new loan. But that ended up being the only interest that the Continental Congress was good for in its term. It was the interest that got refinanced with the Dutch. The bonds at the time of Washington's inauguration were typically trading for 20 to 100. So someone with a $100 bond would get $20 for it, sometimes more, but it was a very, very steep discount. And there were speculators. There was this new class of speculators running around that were grabbing up these bonds. They were going out into the countryside, and in particular to areas hard hit by the action of the War for Independence, like South Carolina, like North Carolina, like Virginia, places where in upstate New York, places where the enemy armies had been marching and the Continental Army had bases of supply. So the Continental Congress was paying for everything with IOUs during the war. And this is where most of these bonds had come from. There was a substantial amount that was owed abroad, 11.7 million foreign debt. The debt to the French and the Spanish had not been serviced at all. And there was over $50 million total. So when Washington takes power, the Congress assembles in New York City. That's the first capital city. New York City furnishes a public building that's deemed Federal Hall. Federal Hall is a new building now. Later on, it was made into a branch bank of the Bank of the United States. It was still called Federal Hall. And now it is a national park just across the street from the Dow Jones Stock Market Exchange. It's on Wall Street. And it's only a very short distance from the grave of Alexander Hamilton himself at Trinity Church. He ends up going to rest down there eventually himself. But when Congress assembles, they establish the first cabinet departments, so the first executive departments. They establish the Department of State, and Washington chooses our very able French ambassador, Thomas Jefferson, to head the Department of State. State only has like 4 employees at this point. Jefferson has a few clerks and a messenger, a courier, I suppose. He establishes the War Department. Similarly, the War Department is extremely small, with a staff of 5 or something. It's General Henry Knox, who famously moved the artillery that had been captured at Ticonderoga over to assist in the siege of Boston. And so General Knox is Washington's war secretary. We also have Treasury. So and the Attorney General. I don't know of any staff. The Department of Justice is actually created much later. The Confederacy in the Civil War has a Department of Justice headed by an Attorney General before the United States actually develops a Department of Justice. That actually gets organized after the Civil War. But we've got the Attorney General, Edmund Randolph of Virginia, formerly an anti-federalist. Jefferson was known for anti-federalist democratic sentiments. So we see Washington is choosing some of his cabinet. They are of differing political backgrounds and persuasions. But the most important of all the departments is Treasury. And Treasury is staffed very generously. There are revenue collectors, customs agents in the port cities, a large staff. This dwarfs all of the other departments. You add up the staff and officers of all the other departments, they don't compare at all to the mammoth structure of Treasury at the very beginning. And this is all testimony to the priority of financial stabilization. So as Congress is voting on establishing and funding the executive departments, they are also working on the Bill of Rights, promised by the Federalists to soothe the concerns of the Anti-Federalists in the ratification debates. And they also quickly pass the very first federal taxes. So we see the Tariff Act of 1789. This amounts to over 80% of federal income as late as 1800. So this is the major funding device for the federal government and the way to retire the debt. It's a 5% ad valorem duty on imports. There are certain protective measures for American industries built into this original funding bill. So there are protective duties on textiles, iron, and certain domestically produced luxuries.
Over and above the 5% flat rate?
That is correct.
Okay.
So this is remarkable because this shows us a protective policy before Hamilton even makes any statements about tax policy or national economic vision.
And to what extent was Hamilton driving the car as opposed to Congress on this?
That's a good question, and my sources did not reveal that. We do have a major report from Hamilton 2 years after this, where he does propose more extensive protective duties to foster American industries. But we see that predates his proposal. The Federalist Congress, and they are majority Federalist by persuasion, not surprisingly. The men that advocated for the ratification of the Constitution are the ones that went in majority to the Capitol as the congressman, as the first Congress. In 89, alongside the Tariff Act, we also have the Tonnage Act. This is a tax on ships docking at American ports. So there is a difference in the tax. Foreign ships have a certain tax rate. American-built ships with foreign owners have a more advantageous tax rate. And then American-built ships with American owners have the lowest of all. So we see in the Tonnage Act a preference, a special protection and sponsorship of American shipbuilders. We also have the Collection Act of '89, once again, establishing customs houses and officers in American port cities. And these are remarkable buildings. Many of them still stand. There are quite a few of them that are in obscure places that are no longer major ports of entry, like Sag Harbor in Long Island. There was a customs house there that was actually the second largest port in New York at the time. And now it's the Hamptons. There's no industry or maritime trade going on there, and it's kind of funny to think there was a big customs house there at one point. But these are very beautiful buildings. Typically, I'm thinking of New Haven, Connecticut, or no, New London, Connecticut. New London, Connecticut has this beautiful dark gray granite federal building. It was the customs house. It's right down on the waterfront. And that's the typical.
Yeah. It's funny how places tend to change in that way. I'm in Chicago, and Chicago, of course, was once one of America's great ports, and now virtually no portage goes on in Chicago proper. It's all shifted south to Calumet, and all of the areas which used to be dockside wharfs are now very expensive office buildings and condos. So it's funny how things change over time.
Indeed. The other major revenue act, which we will come back to later, is the Excise Act of 1791. So another means for the federal government to raise revenue, according to the Constitution, is excise taxes. And these are taxes on certain kinds of production. So the main excise tax in 91 is whiskey. It charged a rate of 6 cents to 18 cents per gallon. And this was a minor revenue stream. Over 80% of the federal revenues are actually coming from the Tonnage Act and the duties in the ports.
And so I imagine it occasioned minimal, if any, controversy.
No, this was a really big deal because of the way the excise tax was written. It was quite expensive for small producers, and it was far more advantageous as far as many less taxes for big producers. So if you produced whiskey in large quantities, then you had a much lower tax rate. So it favored the professional manufacturers of whiskey, and it was very disadvantageous to people that produce small amounts, such as rustic farmers who had no other way to refine their produce and get it to market than to distill it.
Was this arrangement accidental, or was there a policy behind this tilting of the field in that way?
Well, historians have gone both ways on that. More Jeffersonian historians who do not like Hamilton's centralization policies and his special sponsorship of American manufacturers say that this is by design, that it was meant to disadvantage farmers, and it was a way of transferring economic activity into the cities, putting more production in the hands of American capitalists, further centralizing the economy. And there are the defenders of Hamilton, which say that this is a mere accident, that this was not intended. Now, with Hamilton's response later to the Whiskey Rebellion, I I wonder about that reasoning, because Hamilton really did want to crush the whiskey rebels in Western Pennsylvania. He wanted to lead the army. Washington turned him down. Washington personally went out there with 30,000 men, which was larger than any force that he had commanded during the War of Independence. Up till that time, it was the largest force of Americans ever assembled in battle array. And there was no fight. I'm jumping ahead to the Whiskey Rebellion here, but it's very interesting. This takes place in Washington's second administration, so it's kind of long abetting before it actually comes to a head. But another problem with the Excise Act of 91 is that any revenuers who catch people in arrears on this tax or trying to produce whiskey without paying this tax, they are sent, the accused are sent to a federal court, which required them to travel all the way to Philadelphia or the nearest federal courthouse in the case of other states. And that was a very long, onerous, expensive journey to make for them. So Jefferson ends up repealing that Excise Act and also reforming to require any, let's see, it may be Washington that reforms it by the end of his administration, where he requires them to go to the local courthouse instead of traveling all the way to Philadelphia. It was one of his compromises after the Whiskey Rebellion. But that's all a little bit ahead of us. So in 1790, once Hamilton has had a chance to organize Treasury, he's had some months to work. He presents to Congress his first report on the public credit. He proposes to consolidate not just all of the debts of the Continental Congress at par to be paid in full, to finance a new loans to settle long outstanding debts and kind of roll it over. But he also proposes to consolidate the state debts into a national debt. So this is the proposal to create the national debt. There is an outstanding argument going on. It takes place in Congress and at the state level about whose bonds should be redeemed. Now, the proposal is to redeem all of the bonds, and that this is a financial priority. So they want to set up a schedule. They want to start paying on these bonds and then pay them all off in a set time frame. But a lot of these bonds had changed hands. They'd gone over to the speculators who had been buying them up, coming out of mostly New York and Philadelphia. New York is not the super gigantic banking powerhouse that it is now, but it was one of the few American cities that did have banking services. I believe there were 2 banks in New York at the time, and Alexander Hamilton actually started one of them. That was what he was doing when he was called into Treasury. Philadelphia was the more substantial of the 2 cities. They had about the same population at the time, but Philadelphia is remarkable as having a American stock exchange. So these are both major financial centers. The Quakers are very famous for their acumen with finance and banking, and that's one of the reasons why Philadelphia has this outsized presence at the time. Philadelphia very well could have been the first city in America. It's a kind of a curiosity of history that it shifts to New York, but we'll see some of the reasons why that happened. The argument in Congress and at more local and regional levels is, should we find the original bondholders and redeem the bonds to them. Hamilton cuts to the point in his report on the credit, and he says, it's impossible to know. And that's entirely reasonable. There was never any central record of who the bonds were originally given to. There is an awful lot of official paper floating out there and changing hands. And it is payable to the bearer on demand.
Notwithstanding whether it's possible, why would it even be desirable to do that? With people calling for contracts of sales that to be invalidated by fiat just because, or why was that even a debate?
It was a debate because it meant that whoever had sold their bond to a speculator was moving all of the redeemed money and interest into one of the major cities. And this was a political concern and economic concern at the time. We recall in our previous episode, we were talking about how the Republican administrations of the states, I say Republican as opposed to monarchy, right? The American independent states were moving their capital cities inland at this time. And their explicit purpose for this was to get the political class further away from the merchant class, from the bankers and speculators, from the business interests that congregated in the cities. So the capital of South Carolina is moved from Charleston to Columbia. This is part of redistricting processes going on in the states, because the old districts for representation, even in colonial times, were very unbalanced in the representation of the coastline, where the preponderance of the population lived long before. But in the decades leading up to American independence, you see a large number of people going out into the country, especially the decade following the French and Indian War. Indian troubles on the frontier had been settled. You had the great line drawn down the Alleghenies, which was supposed to mark a protected area for the Native Americans behind the Alleghenies. The Americans weren't supposed to go over that line, but everything up to the Alleghenies was open for sale and settlement. And so you have a lot of people going into the backcountry, and those same people, they tend to be religious dissenters like Baptists. You have more established old world congregations, the Episcopalians predominating, that are out in the Tidewater area and on the coastline and in the cities. So there's a religious difference between the two, and the political organization favors the coastline, favors the original capital city and environs, and they want to move the capital inland. They want to get their political class away from the merchants. They are redistricting their states to give the inland parts more representation in the state legislatures. And on the national level, there's broad awareness. Well, a lot of the rustics out in the farm country have surrendered their bonds to speculators. This will move all of the redeemed money for those bonds to the cities, which means the cities are going to have this huge new influx of capital through the redemption of these bonds. It was a small investment that's going to reap really huge rewards for people that were willing to speculate. And they don't want that movement of capital to happen. So this is part of the anti-federalist concern. And I believe I had mentioned before how the anti-federalists were stronger in the countryside in certain states. And this was a key to the win of the Federalists in Virginia. They actually call the vote in the convention before some of the country delegates had arrived at the convention. And the suspicion was they were all going to be anti-Federalists. So the longer they delayed the vote, the more likely it was to fail. So this is one of the concerns, but Hamilton's answer is the only reasonable answer to the question. Are we going to recognize that property has legally changed hands? And there really wasn't an alternative to that. And Hamilton spells it out very clearly in his report. We can't find who the bonds were originally made to. And if we made a call for that, then we would be opening ourselves to limitless fraud. Because how can you prove that someone used to have a bond when we don't have any central record? So this was entirely reasonable on Hamilton's part. What was really more of a legitimate political concern was the inequity among the states themselves. And this was something I believe I touched on last time. The southern states that had large western frontiers were in a much better position to retire their war debts. So it's not just the Continental Congress that has debt, it's also the state governments that have a lot of war debt. And this was a crushing burden for many of them, some of which had special reasons. But states that did not see any military action during the war, such as Delaware, actually, they didn't have war debts. And also they had a small population, and it's a diminutive place. Places like North Carolina, they were selling off the lands over the Alleghenies. They were selling off Tennessee. They retire their war debts this way, and they are not burdened by excessive taxation. The Virginians are selling Kentucky. They are retiring their debts by land sales in the West, and Kentucky is captured in part in the course of the War for Independence, and then the lands north of the Ohio are ceded to the Continental Congress in the Treaty of Paris. But the northern states are having a really hard time with their debts, and South Carolina, partly because South Carolina doesn't have access to the West to sell land. So we have this very disproportionate spread among the states. When Hamilton suggests consolidating the state debts, it's going to affect the states differently. So after Hamilton gives his first report, we see some very interesting things happen. Speculators go bananas. Now, the report is physically given to Congress in New York City, which means that the New York City speculator market are some of the very first recipients of this information, that the plan is to pay off the bonds. Not just the Continental Congress bonds, but also the state bonds, which are also in a seemingly hopeless situation. Massachusetts is under a very crushing burden. Connecticut, New Hampshire. There's a lot of argument about just who has rights to Vermont. And of course, Vermont comes out ahead, and they kind of declare their independence during the War of Independence, and act as an allied power, even though there's hardly anyone there at the time. And then Vermont kind of disclaims all of the arguments from New York and New Hampshire about who has the area. They say they're their own state, and they become a state in the Union. Delightful place, Vermont. I like Vermont's role in our history. But these speculators, they go on the fastest ships that will carry them to Massachusetts, to South Carolina, and they start buying all of the bonds they can get their hands on at whatever price. And so exchange for the bonds rises because all of a sudden there's this new demand. There are lots of speculators going out trying to grab as many bonds as they can. And of course, they go right back to New York. However, Congress demurs on Hamilton's plan. And it's because, well, there's self-serving arguments perhaps about the original bondholders, and that's just an unworkable sort of position. You have people speaking out on that. But the more legitimate claim is, wait a second, what does Virginia get out of this? We don't need our state bonds redeemed by the federal government. We actually don't have many. We're managing our situation fine. This is going to help Massachusetts. It's going to rescue South Carolina. What are we getting out of this? And so they stop it. Now, Hamilton is very disturbed by this. He is very upset. Coincidentally, Thomas Jefferson arrives from France right after the failure of Hamilton's proposal in Congress. Hamilton is outside of the executive residence in New York City. He had just been to see Washington. He didn't see a way to get this through without some compromise between the sections. And Jefferson describes him as looking disheveled and sleepless when he finds him outside the executive mansion. And Jefferson asks him, what's wrong? And Hamilton explains, this is the solution to our financial troubles, but I've got to get it through Congress somehow, and I don't see any way of doing it. So Jefferson invites Hamilton to dinner, and they dine together, like the next day. James Madison shows up, and James Madison is the Speaker of the House, a congressman from Virginia, and a friend of Hamilton. And he's also a very close associate of Jefferson. So they meet at Jefferson's for dinner. And what comes out of this is a congressional deal, a compromise. The states with little debt are going to get a financial payout from the federal government, and the national capital is going to be moved south. It will be moved first to Philadelphia for 10 years. Then it will be moved to the Potomac River, where Maryland and Virginia, both southern states, are going to mark out a 10 square miles on the banks of the Potomac for the federal city. And that will be the future capital of the United States. So that passes Congress. And what comes out of it is Delaware gets $100,000 because they don't have any debt to retire. And this is proportionally calculated in Delaware's case because they are a very small state. North Carolina gets 2.4 million and Virginia gets 3.5 million from the Treasury. And Hamilton gets his consolidation. So Washington then creates the national debt. And the capital is going to be moved southwards. Now, this is a good occasion to talk about different interpretations of the new federal government. We, on American Spirits, have previously done a stream about Charles Beard and his book, The Economic Interpretation of the Constitution from 1913. Beard's thesis is that the federal government is formed not out of political idealism or program, but primarily for economic concerns, that it had a particularly aristocratic design. Beard's argument, and this is a very common argument in American history, is that the Federalist movement and the Philadelphia Constitution are particularly aristocratic as opposed to democratic, particularly indirect as opposed to direct in the representation.
Conservative was the word Beard used.
Yes, indeed. And he didn't like that.
No, no, he did not.
He says it is a Thermidorian reaction to democracy, which is more evident in the revolutionary period.
Mm.
That the Federalists were made up primarily of class interests of creditors, manufacturers, and shippers, opposed to the agrarian Republicans who were more democratic in their outlook.
Mm-hmm.
Now, when you talked about Beard, did you talk about MacDonald?
I don't remember.
Charlie, do you remember talking about Forrest MacDonald?
Nope.
Okay, well, Forrest MacDonald is the scholarly answer to Beard.
Oh, then definitely
He
not. We have not gotten to the counter Beard narrative yet.
Oh, okay. Well, I only mean to touch on it here. We'll get back to Hamilton here in just a second. But Forrest MacDonald wrote a book called We the People, The Economic Origins of the Constitution in 1958. Previous to this, he was known for regional histories. He wrote a book about the development of electrical utilities in Wisconsin. Right? This wasn't of general interest. But he makes a major statement in the historiography with his publication in 58 and becomes a standard American historian. Like, he's a major American historian, and he has a really great body of work. I'm a fan of Forrest MacDonald, and I'll go as far as to say I'm a fan of Beard as well. They've both been big influences on me. But Forrest MacDonald, what he did was he went out and he did character investigations into the major Federalist figures. So he went to the state conventions and he did analyses of Federalists in the state conventions, the first federal Congress, the Federalist members of the Congress, and so on. And what he demonstrated is that they're actually very diverse in their class associations.
Mm-hmm.
That the Federalists are they are very engaged with creditors, manufacturers, banking interests, shipbuilders, merchants, and the like. But there are also lots of farmers who are self-identified as Federalists. Some of them hold bonds, some of them don't. This is not a clear-cut thing, nor is it a class conspiracy as Beard might paint it. So it's not a division between capital and landed property, according to MacDonald. Now, that said, the effect is quite Hamiltonian. So we can look at that and ask the questions, well, perhaps the Federalists are exactly as MacDonald implies, and we don't have any good reasons to think otherwise. This book has been thoroughly investigated since its publication, and no one's come up with a compelling thesis with good evidence contrary to MacDonald. So MacDonald is saying it's coalitions of interests, and that there are legitimate political concerns beyond the economic. And we have every reason to take his word on that. But the effect is centralization. Now, to be clear, MacDonald is also a fan of Hamilton, in spite of his unreconstructed Southern Whig perspective. He describes himself in other places as an unreconstructed Southerner, a partisan on Civil War matters and such. But he also is a fan of Hamilton and wrote a biography of Hamilton in 1979. He praises Hamilton for favoring egalitarian entrepreneurial spirit in American history over the establishment agrarian interests of his time. That he favored entrepreneurs and speculators as opposed to the old oligarchy in America. And that's an interesting perspective. I've appreciation for that. Though I have my issues with Hamilton, that's beside the point. We're here to talk about what Hamilton did, and I want to give him full credit as a visionary of American politics and economics. He deserves all of the credit for that. He envisioned the world that we see today. He still is the basis of any number of arguments about economic or political economy in our own time. Whenever anyone talks about tariff policy, they need to reference Hamilton. And that was because he formed the original policy. And we've been arguing about it ever since, basically.
And the view of him that you say MacDonald takes actually throws into relief an interesting philosophical question about what is freedom really? Do we center freedom around the rights of the individual to farm his family plot and participate in a Jeffersonian democracy? Or do we center freedom around the right to compete, the right to be an entrepreneur, the right to innovate? It's two very different visions of what freedom is, and it's a tension that has dominated our history for centuries.
Absolutely. And that's even more to the point that Hamilton has far more influence on our vision of what is good for America in our situation now than Jefferson could possibly have.
Yeah.
And that's because Jefferson lost, and that's because Jefferson's world is gone now. We do not have a substantial number of property owning Americans, certainly not in farming. It's about 2% of the population now that's making their living off of farming, and almost all of that is consolidated, right? It's
Indeed.
gigantic holdings.
And if you broaden it beyond just farming and just consider the yeoman as an economic unit, the plumber who owns his own business, the trucker who owns his own truck, this small economic unit, whether it be agrarian or otherwise, is coming under increasing pressure as time marches on.
Absolutely. And that's one of the reasons why I say we're living in Hamilton's world. He foresaw this. He made foundational policy to support that vision. And now we're living in that organization almost completely. It's no longer a nation of owners. And this was part of Hamilton's vision of political good. And that's an important element here. So we got to the passage of the consolidation of the debt. What's more consequential in the long run is Hamilton's second report on the public credit, where he proposes the national bank, which is the theme of our series here. In 1791, so while the revenue legislation is going through, while the debt is getting consolidated, Hamilton makes a seminal report on manufactures, in which we see the gist of his policy. Hamilton believes manufacturing is the future, that manufacturing is the course for empire, for making a consumer economy, for patronizing it with domestic industry, for building up domestic capital and making America into a powerful banking house. Hamilton wants the United States to be an international creditor nation. So he first begins his report talking about agriculture, that agriculture is ubiquitous in the United States, that practitioners of agriculture, the farmers, they're economically independent. They also don't have money in their pockets. And Hamilton sees wealth in the exchange of money for goods and services.
Mm-hmm.
He wants to expand the liquidity of the American consumer. He doesn't say consumer, but this is the import here. He wants increased consumption in America. He wants increased circulation of money in America. He says manufacturers are promising. They raise the standard of living. They increase the circulation of money. People are going to have bank accounts. People are going to take out loans on credit as the banking system gets established. This will increase the stock of money in circulation because loans are made out of fractional reserve practices in banking. Now, this is something in Hamilton's report on manufacturing, which is visionary, which is prescient, because Hamilton is one of the first men of his era to grasp the importance of credit to expand the monetary supply.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not that fractional reserve banking is something new. Hamilton just has a deeper perceptive understanding of the effects of a large banking establishment, the effects of people having loans out in the bank, more money to spend now that they pay off in the future. And the interest on the currency actually replaces, or it puts money into circulation. This is a means of money creation.
Yes. This is a point very few Americans understand today, that money is not printed, money is lent, and it is in the act of lending that money is created, effectively ex nihilo.
Yes. And that is one of the philosophical charges against lending money out on interest, that it is an unnatural means of production,
Mm.
that it's not a natural force, it's made of artifice. It's a human creation to make wealth out of nothing. And therefore it is unnatural. It's taking gold and silver and multiplying them. And you put cats together and you get kittens. You put chickens together and you get baby chicks. But if you put corn together and it makes more corn. You put gold and silver together in your purse, it's not supposed to generate more gold and silver. That's not how they naturally behave. So this is an unnatural generation. And that's the old philosophical and theological problem with usury,
Mm-hmm.
just in summary. But the Hamiltonian vision is a vision of an America full of consumers, financialized, using credit tools to move wealth from the future into the present, increasingly urban, increasingly employed for wages. So they have money in their pockets. They're developing savings accounts. They have money to invest in these great manufacturing schemes and such. They're going to buy the products of the manufacturers and such. He specifically rejects the commodity vision of wealth and happiness, that man is most satisfied in using the tools of nature, the natural generative properties of nature, breeding cattle, farming the land, tilling the earth, and bringing products out of the earth, and doing all those other things, which he says it does make them very economically independent, but we want them to have credit. We want them to help expand the monetary supply. We want them to have savings accounts. We want them to be buying goods and services. So this is Hamilton's vision, and you can see how this plays into our world. This is the world that we live in. We can scarcely imagine another now.
It's
Hamilton
interesting.
says, oh, go ahead.
No, please.
Hamilton says the key to generating more manufacturers and increasing this standard in American society is government protection for what he calls infant industries in America. So he wants a protective tariff system. Now, we see that actually predates his report. We already have disproportionate tariffs specifically to protect the competition of certain American industries, textiles, iron, certain luxuries. Hamilton talks a lot about the manufacturing of textiles that's just getting underway in New England at this time. Congress is investing in American-made goods to furnish the capital and such. They're buying carpets manufactured in Massachusetts. They're buying fixtures and such, candelabras and such that are manufactured domestically. So there's a patronage there. This all makes good sense. But Hamilton says we need a policy of government protection. Now, he proposes a scheme in embryo here. It develops with his followers in later times. People like Henry Clay, a good example of this, a scheme to use the money collected in the protective tariffs, because this is an additional tax to protect domestic industry, that should be set in a different fund to develop inland waterways, to develop port systems, to be invested in canals and government-built highways, all of which will serve to make American industry that much more competitive.
And not just American industry, American agriculture. William Cronin wrote an excellent book, Nature's Metropolis, wherein he describes the truly revolutionary nature of the economic prospects afforded to the American farmer by America's great inland waterway system, which allows you to move goods at vastly less expense than you can over land. The Mississippi River and its tributaries, the Great Lakes, these comprise more miles of navigable waterway than in the rest of the world combined. And what you could effectively do was you could go out to Illinois or to Kansas or to Missouri, and you could throw wheat on the ground, and within a year you could be exporting your crop for a profit. For capital and labor investment, it was unprecedentedly small versus the return you could get on it. And Cronin argues that this was the real engine behind the expansion of the American economy.
It is a huge natural resource. Our inland waterways are incredible, and this later on, this is a branch in our American political organization where you have a lot of support, especially in the agricultural West and in the South, especially among the planters, for a certain amount of internal improvements. They would like the federal government to improve the waterways, make them more navigable, some canals, bypasses of rapids, things like that, are part of that.
Indeed, Seward, who is remembered today for his icebox, was really made his bones on the Erie Canal in New York and getting the inland waterway system set up.
Indeed, and the Erie Canal is one of the great examples of success in an internal improvement, and that was done by the state of New York on their own initiative. It did not have federal aid, and there had been other attempts to make canals for economic gain and such. The Erie Canal surprised many because it was such a roaring success almost immediately, and retired the investments with profits only years after it opened. It was such a huge economic boon, and of course it connects Lake Erie to the Hudson Valley. So that's a good example. It was Governor DeWitt Clinton of New York who was one of the major guides for that project. But we see with Hamilton, he has a vision of an economic empire and certainly an economic nationalism we see in his first report on public credit, he wants to make the state level financiers indebted to the federal government, to point their attentions to the federal government that had relieved their financial distress, redeemed their bonds, and so on. It consolidates the economic interests in the union and not with state authorities. Hamilton wants a more active economic policy to protect industry, so protective tariffs, and an internal improvements program, building canals and removing obstructions from waterways and the rest. That is going to foster a bigger economic union. Now, the problem with this, he suggests policies to Congress. Congress does not readily respond. They do allocate money for the building of lighthouses, and this is one of Hamilton's responsibilities in Treasury. The federal government acquires all of the pre-existing lighthouses on the coastline to federally administrate them, and also starts building new ones. That's really the only major federal outlay of money for the proposed internal improvements. But there's a sectional issue here, because once again, we see it's the northern states that have investments in mills. It's northern states where virtually all the urban areas of America are located. As far as we have a consumer market, it is mostly in the northern states, especially for domestic luxuries. So Hamilton's proposed protection of industry, though he paints it as national economic union and prosperity from which all sections will benefit, this is something that is received with great dismay from the Southerners, who are partly because of the disproportionate redemption of state bonds, are already the generous party, you might say, in the federal program. They are the ones that have to be treated with for the compromise. And they do not like this proposal for increased economic centralization, for government sponsorship of private business in tax protection. They say that this is opportunity for favoritism, special privileges, and special lobbying interests in the government, all of which are arguments that should be familiar to us whenever we hear anyone protesting proposed protective tariffs. These things still come up now. So he justifies all of this from the general welfare clause in the preamble of the Constitution, which is exactly what the anti-federalists said would happen, that this is a vague description of government power, and it could be interpreted in any number of ways. The Southerners also argue this is going to create a colonial relation between the sections. The southern states producing raw materials almost exclusively, the northern states taking raw materials and then selling the finished product back to the southern states. So it looks like the triangle trade across the Atlantic all over again, which was a major argument against the British Empire back in 1776. Now, that is a visionary observation, discrimination of the basic problem, that there are economic disparities between the sections, and this is why the sections of the Union are going to side differently on this question over the history of this argument. Hamilton says the General Welfare Clause justifies his action because general welfare covers, quote, everything: the interests of learning, of agriculture, of manufacturing, and of commerce.
It is rather
So
general.
anything, yeah, entirely general. I mean, he even mentions learning. We had to wait till Jimmy Carter to get the Department of Education. Maybe that's a blessing. Madison speaks out against Hamilton's proposal on this occasion. So we see Madison breaking with Hamilton. And we may recall Madison was one of the high Federalists at the very start of the Philadelphia Convention in favor of a much more centralized structure for the proposed Constitution. In favor, to some degree, of Hamilton's proposal to abolish the state governments, to make the state legislatures subordinate to a presidential veto, and to appoint the state governors from the executive branch. Madison rejects Hamilton's report on manufactures and the General Welfare Clause, though earlier in his career, he had interpreted the General Welfare Clause in similar ways. So Madison is tricky because you can find him on several different sides of these questions at different points in his career.
Oh, yes, he's all over the place.
Yes, he's a very mercurial figure. Madison says, government tied down to the specified powers which explain and define the general terms is essential. He says, the meaning of the general terms must be sought in the subsequent enumerations, which limits and details them. Now, this will grow more clear as we understand the opposition to the Bank of the United States later on. Of course, Jefferson is very much of that opinion as well, though we might say much more consistent.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but didn't we have an amendment about this?
Do enlighten me. What is your reference?
The 10th Amendment, which explicitly reserves to the states and the people, respectively, all powers not explicitly designated to the Congress.
Yes. And that does come into play in a short period of time with the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions in 98, of which Madison and Jefferson were the authors of those resolutions. And so we see there, we might interpret that as a retreat from federal level arguments and policy to the interposition of the states in federal policy. The states blocking federal policy, in fact. That's what the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions were. And we'll have occasion to remark on them, I'm sure. So in January of 91, Hamilton gives his first report on the public credit. In December of 91, he gives his second report on the public credit. And this is his very ambitious report. Surprising, the first report was met with such opposition in Congress that it failed initially, and Hamilton had to broker a compromise with Jefferson. The second report he actually gets passed in Congress, his proposal for financial policy. In 1791, he goes to Congress with his report proposing the Bank of the United States. This is a private corporation, a federally chartered corporation to do banking, proposed to have branches across the country in cities. It would work in conjunction with the custom houses, so federal revenues could be deposited in the Bank of the United States. The Bank of the United States was going to have this exclusive province as the depository of treasury funds. The matter was whether or not Congress had power to charter a corporation. Now, in the debate that follows, the opponents of the Bank of the United States reference the Philadelphia Convention, which we must remember the proceedings of which were still under wraps. There were records. They were released many years later, after the death of most involved So it was not public knowledge, just what was debated at the Philadelphia Convention, what was proposed, and so on. But it was a fact. The Philadelphia Conventioneers that wrote the Constitution had debated the power to charter corporations on the federal level. These would be businesses with licenses to operate in all of the member states in the Union. And they had rejected it. So the power is never explicitly stated. Hamilton proposes this private corporation with 80% public ownership. So it would be majority public. And this was not all Americans either. When the corporation was chartered, it came online after Congress passes the bill and Washington does sign it into law. There are substantial numbers of foreign investors who arrive and buy shares. But it would establish a huge pool of credit. It would be the financier to the federal government. It would have the largest by far, as far as credit to loan out in the fractional reserve banking practice. They would finance the federal government. They would retire the old bonds, issue new ones, roll them over, and also gradually pay them off. Important to note here, Hamilton in his first report, I forgot to mention, he gave the very famous line, "A national debt will be to us a public blessing, if not substantial." And that qualification in there is very important because Hamilton was explicitly talking about paying it off. He's also talking about, in the short term, rolling it over into these new institutions. So Hamilton does not want an insurmountable public debt. Hamilton, indeed, would probably die of heart failure if he saw our current national debt. You must remember, he's not saying debt is a good thing in and of itself. What Hamilton is saying is actually something very involved, and it's a businessman's way of thinking. If a lot of people, if you owe money to a lot of people, then a lot of people want you to succeed. And this is it. This is Hamilton's reasoning here. He wants foreign creditors to look on the welfare of the United States. If I was to loan you, Mr. Quinn, $1 million to run a men's haberdashery, let's say you could run the Tie Bar in Chicago. Wonderful place. Sells shirts and ties. I have some of their wares and I like them. I would tell everyone after I've loaned you the $1 million to go and patronize your men's haberdashery. I'd want everyone to buy your silk ties. I'd want everyone to go and get suited up at your shop because I don't want you to go bust.
If you owe France $1,000, you have a problem. If you owe France $3 million, Louis has a problem.
Absolutely. And this is a businessman's way of thinking. And Hamilton was a very accomplished businessman and financier. He understood these things. So he wants to set up this private corporation with these special privileges as regards the U.S. government. So the argument he bases in the necessary and proper clause, that Congress may make laws necessary and proper for the United States. This is what we call the broad construction of the Constitution, a very expansive sort of way of reading the Constitution and of reading special powers for the federal government into the document. He says that the powers are implied in the clause. So even though it doesn't say that the federal government has chartered or has a power to charter corporations, that it's an implied power, and therefore we can go through with this. This is one of his concerns is a major shortage of circulating currency in the United States. We had until this time we had attempted official currencies. The continental dollar was a colossal failure because it was backed by nothing but these worthless bonds. And there are lots of experiments at the local level. So in various places at various times, utility companies could be authorized to issue circulating media that could be redeemed with the company itself, or redeemed, at a discount based on how people thought that company was doing. There were private banks that issued notes. There were many ways of filling in this shortage of hard currency, of circulating media. And the United States was using anything that anyone could get their hands on. And so Mexican silver was circulating, Dutch guilders are circulating, German thalers, which is the origin of our word dollar. It's the name of a valley in Germany that produced very good hard metals for circulation. I think it was silver, though I'm not entirely sure what the thaler was originally.
I believe it was Saxon currency, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes, yeah, it was a valley in Saxony somewhere called Thaler. Yes, pounds, sterling were circulating, French francs were circulating, all this stuff was circulating in America, and it was very difficult to exchange it because they were all differently denominated and such. And then there were all these private currencies circulating. Hamilton wanted to solve this problem by a central bank. So the Bank of the United States, from the very start, it has powers that we would associate today with the Federal Reserve. And we might say that Hamilton is the man who imagined what would become our current Federal Reserve system. Like the Bank of the United States, the Federal Reserve is also a private institution with special government powers involved in it. So the president appoints the board members of the Fed. The Fed issues the currency. Our dollars are Federal Reserve notes today. Hamilton tried to set up a mint in conjunction with this second report. The mint was a failure because of a mistake in valuing the silver. So they were minting silver coin, but the silver coin was all going abroad because if you melted it down, you actually got more than the face value. So there was a problem with the way that was measured at the time. And of course, the price of silver does fluctuate. So that's always a problem with hard currency. But he wants the Bank of the United States to be the new buyer of American bonds, which of course we know whenever our government's in trouble, the Fed steps in and starts buying up all of our bonds. He wants capital investment for increased industry and commerce. And I mentioned the branch banks. Now, this is where Hamilton meets his most bitter opposition of all the things that he proposes. Thomas Jefferson regrets his dealing with Hamilton on the first report and the consolidation of the debt. He says it was the worst decision he had ever made to treat with Hamilton and advocate for Hamilton's policy on that occasion. Kind of in retrospect, after he sees Hamilton's bank report and loses his argument with Washington, Jefferson said later in life, "I have ever been the enemy of banks. My zeal against those institutions was so warm and open at the establishment of the Bank of the United States that I was derided as a maniac by the tribe of bank mongers who were seeking to filch from the public their barren gains."
A tribe of bank mongers. That's an interesting turn of phrase.
Yes, it is. Well, you note in Jefferson's diatribe the barren gains of the banks, which shows us Jefferson's traditional support, which he would have in common with Aristotle, that wealth naturally comes from the natural sources of reproduction in the vegetable world and the animal world and so on. And that money does not naturally reproduce itself and should not by artifice. So he is of that philosophical persuasion. And of course, that is so foreign to our conception of how money works today. It's not something that we have experience with, most of us, because most of us don't have a connection with bringing wealth out of the land or bringing wealth out of our animals and such. That's something that's foreign to most Americans now and most people in the modern world. And so we find Jefferson's position as quaint as that of Dante, who puts usurers in hell with the sodomites, by the way, and for the same reason, because they have perverted God's natural plan of reproduction. It's a curious image in Dante in the Inferno. Well, this goes to Congress, and here is where I conclude for us today. The Northern congressmen were very enthusiastic for Hamilton. So north of the Mason-Dixon line, Hamilton gets 33 for the Bank of the United States and only 1 against. The Southern vote is quite opposite. 19 against in the states south of Mason and Dixon's line, only 6 for Hamilton's bank. There is a veto consideration on this, and this is an occasion for an awful lot of comment, and we will get to that in our next episode. George Washington asks his cabinet for their opinions on the bill because it is of such constitutional importance. Jefferson and Attorney General John Randolph write opinions against the ratification or against signing into law the Bank of the United States. Alexander Hamilton from Treasury writes in favor of his baby. And George Washington accepts Hamilton's argument and signs the bill into law. And that will be the discussion of our next episode on American spirits, the debate of Jefferson and Hamilton concerning the bank and its constitutionality.
Indeed, that is a weighty subject, which, as you have elucidated today, profound implications, if somewhat interrupted implications for a little while there, but nevertheless, profound implications for the current world we inhabit.
Absolutely.
Well, Mr. Bagby, I hope that you are appropriately proud of our upright and morally correct chat. For, just as in the course of nature, 3 gold pieces set together will not generate any further issue, so it is that 3 talking heads gabbing at each other for an hour have generated no super chats. So wallow in your moral rectitude, chat. Your Aristotle would be proud. Mr. Bagby, do you have anything to shill in hopes of perhaps squeezing something from this endeavor before we sign off for the evening?
Yes, indeed. I have my website, which is www.tallmenbooks, that's MEN, tallmenbooks.com, where you can find all of the books that I've republished. I have a few more that will come online tomorrow, a new series of biographies of famous American Indian leaders. Now I have 3 of those coming on. So do check that out. I've got several dozen books there, including my new American history text, which I reproduced from the 1920s, An American History by David Muzzy. That's one of my new offerings.
Ah, that sounds very exciting. And I commend to your attention, whether it be for approbation or opprobrium, the fact that Miss Dawn Browning has ridden in at the last moment to gift one membership to this chat to the Old Glory Club. Thank you, Miss Browning. As ever, your generosity is a light of sunshine that shines upon my shriveled heart. Charlie, have you any valediction?
I suppose we'll need to do more Warhammer streams if we want more money. That's the only way.
Indeed. All right. Well, thank you very much, George. Thank you very much, Charlie. And thank you very much, chat.